Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, those who are listening. I am Eszter Kismődi, Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matter, and I'm very, very warmly welcoming today in this conversation Gita Sen to talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights and development justice in connection to the launch of a Global South Coalition. Thank you so much for being here, Gita, today.
My pleasure, Esther.
We are long-term colleagues and collaborators, but let me just give to the audience an introduction about you, Gita, that you are a globally recognized feminist economist from India, founding member of DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, a professor emerita at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. And your work has been absolutely instrumental, I don't know, Gita, for 5 decades, 6 decades in shaping global debates. And I'm sorry, for a couple of decades in a lifetime. So you have been shaping, initiating, leading global debates and action, linking gender equality, development justice, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. For us, it's very important to recognize, and we are very proud that you are a member of the Board of Trustees of SRHM. You are one of the guest editors of our 2018 issue on addressing disrespect and abuse during childbirth and facilities. You are an author of many articles in the RHM, SRHM, and the reviewer. And I'm really, really, truly amazed about your energy, activism, that here we are today talking about establishment of a coalition that is so timely today. How do you do it, Gita?
Well, let me start by very quickly thanking you for inviting me to be on this podcast. And then to just go on to say, I'm amazed as well. I mean, at a time when I ought to be, relaxing and saying, yes, we did marvelous things long ago, I find myself completely drawn back into the midst of what is probably one of the most difficult periods for sexual and reproductive health and rights that I have known, at least. And I think since we could say pretty much since the conferences of the early 90s, Rio, Vienna, Cairo, Beijing, and so on, this is probably the most difficult period. So let me say a little bit about the coalition itself. Why do we need a new coalition now? What is it that we are trying to do? So this coalition is just a little over, it's about 14, 15 months old now, of which about 8 months is more formally as the coalition, and the period before that we were talking, thinking, acting, coming together to see whether there would be an interest and whether enough people felt it was an important thing to do. So the coalition itself, it calls itself the Global South Coalition for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights and Development Justice. So this is the part that I want to really focus on. How have these two parts, SRHR on the one side and development justice on the other, come together?
Exactly, Gita. I think this is fascinating, and I think this podcast is so important for us that there were so many framings from the population to sexual and reproductive health rights, then a very strong gender equality feminist framing that all is valid, the human rights, all is valid, but why development justice now?
Okay, so let me say a little bit about the fact that the attention to development justice or development itself, and I think we meant the same thing by that, goes right back to the feminist and women's movements that came together before Cairo and Beijing. Already in the 2 years or so of preparation for Cairo and Beijing, which were, as we all know, really the product, the brainchild, the physical child of the feminist movements, we were already very concerned about the connections between bodily autonomy, individual rights, personal freedoms, and the larger economic, political economy development framing within which those human rights are located and situated. In fact, one of the big arguments, and it was a South versus North argument within the women's movement at that time, was why do we need to be talking about reproductive health and rights? Why do we always think about women in terms of reproduction? Shouldn't we be talking about women's health more broadly as part of a larger framing of development justice, health for all, and the People's Health Movement and so on? And our response at that time, which fortunately then got accepted by the majority of the women, of the feminist movements, was that, yes, that's absolutely correct. We are in support of women's health and all people's health, in fact, but unless we talk specifically about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and unless we talk about gender inequality and women's and girls' particular challenges to recognize those, if we don't talk about those, nobody else will. So if we leave it to the larger progressive health movements to be concerned about our bodies, our physical and bodily autonomy and integrity, our rights, if we leave it to others, it will never happen, or it may never happen.
Exactly.
And so we need specifically to focus on this, but always within the context of the larger development agenda. And if you remember, even in the early 1990s, structural adjustment programs, economic austerity programs, globalization challenges, all of those were already very much shaping the larger political economy of development and of the relationship between the, as we used to call it in those days, first world and third world, as we call it now, North and South, was already a huge set of issues. So the South-North divide on development, in those days, there was a lot of concern about ODA and 0.7% allocations for overseas development assistance, but there are many, many other things, the deep roots in colonial history that we all recognize at this point, for the inequalities between South and North, the dominance of the North over global economic institutions, whether it's the World Trade Organization, which would not allow, in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, wouldn't allow a waiver on intellectual property, those are all divisions and distinctions that have been there from that time and have gotten, in a sense, much, much worse in the period up to now. And
can I just ask it? Exactly. And then, I mean, it was such a huge achievement, ICPD. And then 30 years after ICPD, we are here. And the urgencies still talk about development justice, but in a completely sharper, almost in a more crisis-driven way. So what is the momentum? Why again development justice is the framing?
Why now?
Why now, exactly?
I think the why now is because, in fact, although I would argue, if you look at the ICPD program of action, if you look at the Beijing platform for action, development is at the heart of those documents. But over time, less and less did its importance remain. And in a sense, even advocates began to talk about SRHR, for instance, in much narrower silos. Yeah. Safe abortion, adolescent health,
contraception,
comprehensive sexuality education, LGBT and sexual rights, so it got siloed and the development narrative got lost. What has happened because of that is that we have had our religious patriarchal opposition begin to take complete advantage of that, of those schisms, of those splits. So, the framing that would then pose the North as the champions of SRHR and bodily autonomy, and the South as the champions of the right to development and development justice, meant that these two really got split apart. And in between, we found things like the Holy See becoming the champion of debt reduction and poverty removal on the one hand, while completely holding to their patriarchal, not just their own beliefs, but the vigor and energy with which they propound those beliefs everywhere against access to safe abortion, against access to reproductive health and sexual health, against bodily autonomy. So this is a split that has become worse and worse. And we felt in all of this mess, with northern countries being champions of bodily autonomy and SRHR, but unwilling to regulate their corporations and the extractivism of their corporations, the unwillingness to allow, for instance, I think COVID-19 was the most brutal experience of that.
Can you just talk about a little bit, just to understand the nuances about, because it's very illustrative. I was just listening to François Girard and your conversation, but those who may not listen, just a little bit of illustrative, how it worked out.
Absolutely. We may have forgotten because we're all trying to forget that there was a pandemic at all. But if you remember, during the pandemic, there was this massive inequality in just the basics of access to vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostic, kits and personal protection equipment. Huge global inequalities. The North had all of it, and tragically, many northern countries hoarded vaccines beyond their safety dates and then destroyed them. Whereas in the South, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, vaccine access was miserable, was simply was below 15, 20%. That was the kind of inequality we had during the pandemic. And why? The South kept arguing in the World Trade Organization, please allow a waiver on in the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, the TRIPS agreement being the one that protects intellectual property, and allow the freer production of vaccines in the South at lower cost to be distributed, but just give a waiver for 3 years, a time-limited waiver, after which you can go back to business as usual. And they would not agree to that. So the inequality in access to vaccines. And then on top of that, the economic institutions. Do you know that over 100 countries, right in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, when all of the policy, experts and everybody was saying countries need to invest in their health systems, put more money into making sure that their health systems are stronger, their primary health care works, health workers are able to function, financing is adequate, supply chains are good. In the middle of all of that, over 100 countries were implementing fiscal austerity measures, largely at the encouragement, we can call it that, to be
nicely
light,
exactly.
Of the Bretton Woods institutions and particularly the IMF. So
that
what was
incredible.
it? So where, if you're implementing fiscal austerity, where is the money going to come from to improve health systems?
Absolutely.
So these kinds of inequalities clearly have generated a level of, I feel, bitterness in the international and cynicism in the international arena, which was not there in the early 90s.
How does it link as well in terms of to your goals and how you are framing the SRHR and the development justice through your coalition? Like how do you see that it can help and in what way?
I think, let me turn the question a little bit to say that one of the things as we began thinking about and setting up this coalition was our experience in the last CPD, the last commission, last year's commission on population and development, where we saw big players, big countries come in, wanting really to, in a sense, destroy the SRHR agenda, but they also didn't believe in many other things. Big and not so big countries. For instance, Argentina was on that side. Argentina didn't believe in explicitly didn't believe in SRHR, opposed it. Argentina didn't believe, argued against Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. And so it became clear that what might have been simply an opposition to SRHR and gender equality, I'm saying simply, but of course there's nothing simple about that, has now broadened and become much wider. And suddenly countries began realizing, oh my God, what is it that is going down here? And I think right now, just as we've finished the meetings of the Commission on the Status of Women, which were very, very, very challenging, in fact, was the recognition that there is a full-scale attack on multilateralism itself. Now, I would be the first person, along with many, and I know the United Nations very well. It's a large bureaucracy. It has all of the challenges of a bureaucracy. It is, can be not very nimble and not very effective sometimes, but it is also the only thing we have. It is what stands between us and naked power, the naked exercise of power. And of course, like all bureaucracies, and of course, like any intermediaries, there will be hypocrisy, there will be inadequacy, all kinds of things, but it's what we have. And right now, I think more and more of us have begun to understand that this is about, in fact, a battle over multilateralism, not going back to the bad old days before the United Nations even existed.
And where do you see, sorry, I didn't want to cut you.
Yeah.
Please finish your sentence, but also where do you and your colleague and those who are launching this coalition, where do you see the opportunities?
Okay, so we had our first big meeting. It was an invited meeting, and we are, it's a global South coalition, mainly because it is led from the global South. And the reason for that is not that we don't think these are issues for the global North, not that we don't recognize that there is a South within the North and a North within the South as well in terms of inequalities, but because it is important that the voices and lived experiences of those of us who live in and work from the global South, in fact, are foregrounded. It is that which gives credibility when we talk about development justice. We don't then get seen as some, as do-gooders or charity or, assistance or that. We are seen as rights holders. We are seen as the champions for a different kind of global political economy, one in which there is development justice at every level, from the level of finance ministries and the IMF and the World Bank down to what happens and intersecting forms of inequality within our own societies.
Exactly.
Between, in India, for instance, the rights of Dalit women who are poor, and what that means, what development justice means in that context. So I think that's the reason. But we really welcome alliances and allies from the North as well, who are willing to acknowledge and recognize the importance of doing this and the credibility of a voice that speaks for development justice. And I think that that's what we're working on. So we had our first big meeting in early September in Johannesburg. I say big, it was about 40 people, not that big. But representing different regions and some others. And then we we were present. We said, okay, we need to make our voices heard in different places. So we were present at the family planning meeting in Bogota, and also at the World Social Development Summit, World Summit for Social Development, 2 in Doha in November. Right. But then we got completely drawn into this whole business of the UNET reforms, and in particular, this push to merge UN Women and UNFPA. Yeah, and we have been very, very active in that, raising the questions and saying, please, let's not sleepwalk into something like this with all of the attendant risks and challenges to the mandates of these organizations, and just creating one large entity whose mandates are not protected and which has a big target on its back for all of the opposition.
But it's raising the question whether it's ignorant or incredibly strategic, because you can, while there are overlapping mandates, you can smartly kill both with this merge, possibly, right?
Absolutely, you can kill both. And I argue, from the time of Beijing, when we began talking about the importance of gender mainstreaming, everybody was saying mainstreaming, mainstreaming. And then we realized very soon, within a few years, that it was not an either or. We need both gender mainstreaming across different institutions, agencies, and so on, but we also need the anchor organization that will push the agenda forward. You can't just say mainstream, then everything fritters away, whereas the accountability is lost and then nobody is there pushing the agenda. But you can't just have one agency doing it, then everybody says, oh, it's their issue, and no one does anything. So we know that we need both. I believe that if we're thinking about gender equality, UNFPA focus on SRHR and gender equality in the last 30 years is an excellent example of mainstreaming.
Mm-hmm.
What used to be an agency largely focused on family planning and population control became much more attuned to and focused on and sensitive to SRHR and gender equality. That's looking at population through the lens of gender equality and women.
And rights. I mean, they also championed in some way in their role that is more programmatic. But the rights, I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't talk about rights, how it's integrated in the UN program.
Absolutely.
Gita,
Exactly.
I'm really, really looking forward to hear more. Can you say a little bit more about the launch on the 31st, so those who are listening can listen more? And I think, as you said, there will be more details. You will have invited guests. Can you please tell more about the launch?
Yes. So thank you, first of all, to SRHM for being willing to publicize our launch for us. And that's really, really very helpful. First of all, let me say it will be in 4 languages, English, but with French, Spanish, and Portuguese interpretation. It's not just a launch to say, what is the Global South Coalition about? There'll be a little bit of that, but then a large portion of the launch is actually a moderated panel, which brings together experts from largely the Global South to be speaking to the connections between SRHR and development justice. So I can give you the names. So there will be speaking on human rights. There will be Rajat Khosla, who heads the PMNCH, Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health. There will be Magdalena Sepulveda, who is the director of UNRIST and who has done huge amounts of work on the global political economy of development.
Also as a special rapporteur and in various,
has been
exactly.
The special rapporteur. Exactly. There will be Laleng Mofokeng, who's, of course, the special rapporteur on the right to health. There will be Chi Yokling, and Yokling is the executive director for the Third World Network, which does a lot of work on related to trade and investment and in relation to the World Trade Organization. And speaking from Dawn's perspective, we of course have collaborated very closely with the Third World Network, most recently in the Feminist for a People's Vaccine campaign during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will be moderating that panel. And we will also have remarks from Levi Singh, who is a youth activist from South Africa, who is one of the coordinators of the SRHR Africa Trust based in Joburg in South Africa. So it's an exciting panel, and we expect that we'll have some really interesting insights. So you're all very welcome to
Thank you so much.
You'll come in large numbers. It's virtual, so you can do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gita, and the details. I think in several languages you shared with us the flyer will be also available on SRHM social media and on our blog if people want to sign in, and there are in many other platforms as well. Thank you so much for this conversation, Gita. Really appreciate. Looking forward to the launch and looking forward for collaboration with the coalition in as many ways possible. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Eszter, for having me and giving me this opportunity to speak about the Global South Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you.